They say the cruelest betrayals often come from those who smile the widest when they take everything from you. I learned that lesson not from an enemy on the street, but from a polished man in an expensive suit who shared my office hallways and carried the family name that kept him untouchable. My name is Elena Carter. I am 37 years old, and for nearly 12 years, I worked as the lead systems architect at Helios Data Corps, a cybersecurity company that loved to boast about being built on family values. I am originally from Denver, Colorado, though my career carried me across states until I finally built a home in Chicago. I lived and breathed code, system, and structures no one else dared to touch. And for more than a decade, I carried that company's future on my back. I believed loyalty meant something. I believed hard work could never be erased. I was wrong. It happened 3 days before I was scheduled to receive my $88,000 performance bonus, the reward for completing a project so complex that half the engineering staff refused to take it on. I stayed up nights writing the very engine that gave Helios its negotiating power with the giants of the industry. My mind was drained, my eyes bloodshot, but my heart carried pride, because I had done what others could not. I had given them something unbreakable. I thought, at the very least, I had earned stability. Instead, I was called into an office that did not belong to a leader, but to a boy playing with power he did not deserve. Brandon Hale was 32 years old, the nephew of our CEO. He had the confidence of a man who had never been tested, the smirk of someone who had never been told no, and the arrogance of a child who thought the world was his inheritance. He did not shake my hand. He did not look me in the eye. Instead, he slid a thin sheet of paper across his spotless desk. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, almost gleeful. "You will not be part of the new era," he said. His words did not sound like a decision. They sounded like a sentence. I remember staring at the paper in silence. My throat tightened, and my palms grew hot. In that moment, every late night I had spent in that cold server room came rushing back. Every time I had patched holes in the system no one else could find. Every time I defended our infrastructure against attacks. I thought of the mornings when I walked into the building with pride, believing my work mattered. And in a single moment, with one careless phrase, Brandon Hale stripped it all away. Not because of my failure, not because of performance, but because he believed removing me was convenient for his ambition. Inside, I felt two things. The first was the sting of humiliation, the feeling of being discarded like an outdated tool. The second, buried beneath that wound, was something sharper and colder. Resentment. Not the kind that cries in the night, but the kind that waits, the kind that remembers, the kind that knows arrogance has a way of cutting itself when it swings too wildly. I looked at Brandon as he leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his cruelty. He thought he had silenced me. He thought I would walk away powerless. What he did not know was that by firing me, he had already set in motion the very downfall he thought he had avoided. I signed the letter without trembling, though my heart thundered. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. As I placed the pen back on his desk, I lifted my eyes and held his gaze for the first time. I wanted him to see the quiet storm building in me. He shifted slightly, as if my silence unnerved him, but his arrogance returned in seconds. He thought he had won. But inside me, a seed of vengeance was planted, not through rage, but through knowledge. I knew something he did not. I knew that this so-called strike against me was the first cut in his own downfall. As I walked out of that office, I carried more than a box of my belongings. I carried 12 years of sacrifice, a lifetime of skill, and a truth that Brandon Hale had been too careless to uncover. My story did not end that day. It began. And as the elevator doors closed in front of me, I whispered to myself words he would never hear until it was too late. This is not the end, Brandon. It is the beginning of yours. When you work in technology long enough, you learn that the smallest lines of code, the tiniest clauses in a contract, can hold the power to topple entire empires. Brandon Hale thought he had cut me off cleanly when he fired me, but what he did not know was that years earlier, I had negotiated a provision buried so deep in my employment agreement that no one in his position would have noticed. It was not flashy, it was not loud, but it was precise. If my employment was terminated within 90 days of completing a major integration milestone, then full ownership rights of my encryption engine would transfer to me. Not to the company, not to the board, not to anyone else. To me. That clause had been drafted at a time when Helios Data Core was struggling to keep talent, and I had been one of the few architects willing to stay when projects grew difficult and morale was low. Our old legal counsel had agreed to the terms, believing they were harmless, never imagining anyone in leadership would be reckless enough to trigger it. For years, that clause sat untouched, a ghost buried in the paperwork. Waiting, Brandon had just awakened it. I remember the first time I reread that contract after signing it. I was 31 then, young enough to still believe in fairness, but old enough to know corporations always looked after themselves first. I smiled when I saw the clause. It felt like a quiet insurance policy, like a promise to myself that if the day ever came when loyalty meant nothing, I would not leave empty-handed. I never thought it would actually be invoked, not after all the years of building trust and proving my worth. But in that office, with Brandon's smug words still ringing in my ears, I realized it was more than just a safety net. It was a weapon. The engine I had built was not just another program. It was the spine of Helios's future. A multi-layered encryption system designed to withstand the kind of quantum attacks that terrified governments and corporations alike. Without it, Helios was just another mid-level cybersecurity firm scrambling for contracts. With it, they were positioned to sign a $240 million acquisition deal with Armitage Global Networks, a European powerhouse desperate for exactly what I had created. Brandon thought firing me was a show of dominance. In truth, it was the single most destructive move he could have made. As I left the building that day, I felt the papers in my bag and knew I had something no one else could touch. Brandon could sit in that office and imagine he had secured his legacy, but he had not read the fine print. He had not cared enough to understand that when he pushed me out, he had also pushed the company's future right into my hands. And there was something bitterly satisfying about that. I sat in my car in the parking garage, staring at the wheel, letting the weight of it sink in. My heart was still heavy with anger, still raw with the sting of betrayal, but beneath it was a strange calm. I was not powerless. I was not erased. I was holding the single thread that could unravel everything Brandon thought he controlled. The irony was almost poetic. A man who had never written a single line of code, who never once understood the systems he bragged about, had just given me the keys to the one thing no amount of nepotism could buy. That night, as I read through my copy of the contract again, I traced my finger over the clause and whispered the words to myself like a vow. Termination within 90 days transfers full ownership rights of the encryption system to the architect of record, Elena Carter. My name in black ink. My work, my design, my property. For 12 years, they had called it Helios's crown jewel, But within 72 hours, it would no longer belong to them. It would belong to me. For the first time since Brandon handed me that letter, I smiled. Not out of joy, but out of recognition. He believed he had ended my career, but what he had really done was ignite a countdown. In 3 days' time, the future of Helios Data Core would no longer rest in their boardrooms or their conference calls. It would rest in mine. By the time I woke the next morning, my anger had cooled into something sharper, something more deliberate. I knew what Brandon did not. Helios Data Core was not simply preparing for the future. They were betting everything on it. For months, whispers had circled the office about an acquisition, late-night boardroom meetings, executives flying overseas, and lawyers shuffling contracts back and forth. Eventually, the name emerged: Armitage Global Networks, a European technology giant with deep pockets and an urgent need to secure their cloud empire. Their entire infrastructure had been left vulnerable to advanced attacks, and my encryption engine was the missing piece they were desperate to buy. It was not just a contract. It was the deal of a lifetime, valued at $240 million, a sum that could reshape Helios overnight. Brandon's uncle, our CEO, had staked his reputation on closing it. The board dreamed of the windfall, the press releases, the stock surge. They wanted to be more than a mid-tier firm surviving on government scraps. They wanted power, prestige, recognition, and all of that rested on one system: my system. I had spent nearly 3 years designing the engine, refining it, tearing it apart, and rebuilding it until it could resist even the theoretical threats of quantum computing. I poured my late nights and weekends into it. I skipped vacations, holidays, and family gatherings. My life, in some ways, had been absorbed into its code. They called it a product. To me, it was a living creation, a fortress of logic and mathematics that no one else had the patience or skill to build. And now, that fortress was no longer theirs to sell. The irony was brutal. Armitage Global was not interested in Helios's name, or its leadership, or its bloated hierarchy of executives who took credit for work they never understood. They were interested in the engine alone. Without it, the $240 million deal collapsed into nothing but wasted signatures and empty promises. That was the truth Brandon never grasped when he handed me my termination letter. He thought I was expendable. He did not realize that in discarding me, he had discarded the very foundation of the future he was trying to buy. I imagined the boardroom conversations happening that morning. Brandon probably leaned back in his chair, bragging about cutting me loose, telling them the bonus had been saved, the payroll slimmed, the company leaner for the big merger. He would grin, certain he had proven himself decisive, a leader who could cut ties without hesitation. None of them knew yet that he had just pulled the rug out from under their grandest plan. I almost wished I could have seen their faces when the truth came. Almost. Still, I was not naive. I knew corporations fought like cornered animals when threatened. Helios would not hand me congratulations and walk away quietly. They would fight tooth and nail to hold on to what they believed was theirs. But contracts are not ruled by emotion. They are ruled by ink, and mine was ironclad. The countdown had begun, and in 72 hours, the encryption engine would belong solely to me. Helios could shout, sue, or stall, but they could not change what was written. That knowledge steadied me. I felt my resentment simmer into resolve. Brandon Hale had played his move. Now it was my turn. And mine would not be loud. Mine would not be reckless. Mine would be exact. Because unlike him, I had spent my life learning that the smallest, quietest details are often the ones that decide the fate of everything. I sat at my kitchen table that night, a cup of coffee cooling beside me, and looked over the acquisition documents that had leaked to my inbox weeks earlier. I traced the numbers, the signatures, the assumptions. Every line told me the same story. Without me, the deal would never close. And in that moment, I realized something that made my pulse quicken with equal parts fear and anticipation. I was no longer the discarded employee. I was the deal itself. And in 3 days' time, when ownership passed into my hands, Armitage Global would not be calling Brandon Hale. They would be calling me. The thing about arrogance is that it blinds a person faster than any truth ever could. Brandon Hale thought he had executed a clean strike, the kind that would save the company money, remove what he called old leadership, and prove his worth to the board. But what he never understood was that every action has a consequence, and sometimes the sharpest wounds are the ones you never meant to inflict. By firing me 3 days before my bonus, he had not cut costs. He had lit a fuse. I imagined him sitting in that office the next morning, sipping expensive coffee, boasting to anyone who would listen about how he was ushering in what he kept calling a new era. His words echoed in my head like an insult. He believed trimming me from the roster would make him look strong, decisive, the kind of man fit to take the reins from his uncle one day. In reality, his ignorance had already triggered a process that not even the CEO himself could reverse. The countdown was silent, invisible to the untrained eye, but I could feel it in my bones. In 72 hours, the ownership of my encryption engine would legally transfer to me, not to Helios Data Core, not to their board, not to any investor waiting for a payout. To me, the woman Brandon had dismissed as expendable. He thought firing me was the final word. In truth, it was the first line of a story he would never control. The irony struck me again and again. Brandon had never touched a line of code in his life, but he strutted around like the architect of the future. He wore cufflinks worth more than most of the junior engineers' paychecks and believed they gave him authority. But in his rush to play king, he overlooked the one detail that mattered most. He never read the fine print. He never cared enough to learn that the very system he was betting $240 million on was tethered directly to me. His ignorance was not just careless. It was fatal. I sat in my apartment that night with the city lights stretching across the horizon. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. Not because I had been wronged, but because I knew justice was already moving silently toward him. He would not see it coming. He would not hear it until the moment it crashed down on him. He thought I had walked away with nothing, but in truth, I was walking away with everything. Still, I could not deny the sting that lingered in me. 12 years of service meant nothing to them. 12 years of loyalty was erased with a single piece of paper. They saw me as replaceable, as a liability to be removed before a payout. That wound was deep, and it burned. But in a strange way, it fueled me. Every ounce of resentment became energy. Every memory of Brandon's smirk became a reminder of what was at stake. He had drawn the line, but I would be the one to finish the fight. The ignorant blow he had struck was not against me alone. It was against his own empire, his own reputation, his own fragile legacy. When the truth revealed itself. And it would, very soon. It would not just cut him. It would gut everything he believed he had built. That knowledge kept me steady. It kept me patient. I did not need to lash out. I did not need to fight loudly. All I had to do was wait, and the arrogance of Brandon Hale would destroy him far more effectively than I ever could. As I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, a thought whispered through me, half anger, half satisfaction. Brandon thought I was finished, but what he had really done was hand me the match. And soon, the blaze he started would be the very fire that consumed him. There is a certain silence that comes when you realize the war has already shifted in your favor. Not because you shouted, not because you fought back in public, but because you hold something the other side does not even know they have lost. That was the silence I carried as I prepared to leave Helios Data Corps for the last time. Brandon Hale thought he had written my ending. In truth, he had just handed me the opening chapter of his own. When I walked back into the office after that meeting, the air felt different, sharper somehow. People stared at me with wide eyes, some with sympathy, others with relief that it was not their turn. A few even whispered as I passed. In corporate life, no one wants to be near the person who has just been cut, as though proximity itself might spread misfortune. I kept my head high, though inside me my chest ached with humiliation and fury. I had given this place 12 years of my life, and I was leaving with the cardboard box and silence as my farewell. But under that silence, I also carried something they could not see. I packed my belongings slowly, deliberately. The framed photo of my parents, the small cactus that somehow thrived under fluorescent light, the notebooks filled with sketches of systems I had built long before Brandon knew what a server rack was. Each item I placed in the box was a reminder that I had been more than an employee here. I had been the backbone. I had been the one holding the walls up while executives like Brandon played at being leaders. And when I placed my external hard drive on the desk, I let a faint smile curl across my lips. It was not the real one. It was a decoy filled with nothing but test files, a hollow shell that looked important enough to tempt him. I left it there on purpose. I wanted him to believe he had taken everything. When I walked toward the elevator, I felt his eyes on me from across the hall. Brandon stood by his office door, arms folded, his smirk still plastered across his face as if firing me had elevated him. He looked at me as though I were a piece already removed from the board. I met his gaze and held it for a moment, letting him see no anger, no desperation, just calm. Because calm unnerves men like Brandon. They feed on reactions, and when you deny them that, you leave them wondering what you know that they do not. The elevator doors closed with a metallic thud, and in that narrow box of steel, I finally let my shoulders drop. I exhaled a breath I did not realize I had been holding. My hands tightened around the box, not from fear, but from restraint. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell every single person in that building that they had just made the gravest mistake of their careers. But I did not. Revenge is not loud. It is not emotional. It is precise, like a scalpel, and it cuts deeper when it is patient. That night at home, I placed the box of belongings in the corner of my apartment and opened my laptop. I scrolled through the contract again, reading the clause over and over until the words felt like a promise written just for me. In 3 days, ownership of the encryption engine would be mine. Helios could not stop it. Brandon could not undo it. All I had to do was prepare the stage for the moment the transfer was official. And so I began. I created a quiet little timer, an automated email addressed not to Helios, but to the legal division at Armitage Global. In its lines were no accusations, no rage, no unnecessary words, just a statement of fact. Ownership had shifted, and Carter Innovations, LLC, would now hold the rights. I scheduled it to send the moment the clock struck, the instant the contract granted me full control. Then I closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and let the weight of it sink in. They thought I had left empty-handed. They thought they had stripped me of everything I built. In truth, I had walked away with the one thing that mattered most, and soon they would learn the difference between cutting someone loose and cutting your own future away. The first night after I walked out of Helios Data Core, sleep did not come easily. My body was exhausted, but my mind pulsed with a sharp clarity I had never felt before. It was as though 12 years of silence and swallowed resentment had finally sharpened into a single point. I was not merely leaving behind a job. I was stepping into a game I had not chosen, but one I now intended to win. Brandon Hale believed he had stripped me of everything. He did not know that I had already begun threading the rope that would tighten around his neck. I spent the hours after midnight drafting and redrafting the email that would change everything. The words mattered. They needed to be professional, factual, not emotional. Armitage Global's lawyers were not people who cared for stories of betrayal or personal grudges. They cared for ownership, contracts, signatures, and the law. So I stripped it of all unnecessary detail and left only the truth. Effective immediately upon contractual transfer, ownership of the Helios encryption system will rest solely with Carter Innovations, LLC. Any licensing discussions must proceed directly through my office. That was all. Precise, cold, irrefutable. But timing mattered even more than words. The clause would activate exactly 72 hours after termination. That meant the moment I had signed Brandon's letter, a clock had started ticking. I set my email to launch at the precise second the contract gave me full authority. No earlier, no later. An execution scheduled by law itself. The idea almost made me laugh. Brandon thought he had engineered my downfall, yet the paperwork he ignored would deliver me the most powerful strike against him. Still, I did not want to leave it entirely to automation. So I called an attorney I trusted, an old friend from my early years in Denver. His name was Marcus, 40 years old, sharp as glass, and twice as dangerous when backed into a corner. I explained the situation carefully, reading the clause aloud and sending him the documentation. On the other end of the line, he was silent for a long moment before letting out a slow whistle. "Elena," he said, "do you realize what you're holding here? You're not walking away with scraps. You're holding the future of their company." I knew it, but hearing someone else say it made the weight heavier, more real. He advised me to stay quiet, to keep my head down until the transfer was official. "Do not tip your hand," he warned. "They think you're gone. Let them believe it." His words settled into me like steel. It was tempting to gloat, to strike early, but revenge is not about impatience. Revenge is about timing. And timing was already on my side. The next day, I went about my routine as though nothing had changed. I made coffee, answered a few personal emails, even went for a long walk through the park. On the surface, I looked like any other woman recovering from being fired. But beneath that calm, I was pulling strings no one could see. Every hour brought me closer to the moment when the foundation of Helios's grand $240 million deal would collapse. And the beauty of it was that I did not need to lift a single finger after that. The clause itself would do the work for me. As the sun set that evening, I found myself standing by the window, looking down at the glowing city below. For the first time since Brandon's smirk and those cruel words. "You will not be part of the new era." I felt no sting, no humiliation. I felt control. absolute, undeniable control. He thought I had left powerless, when in truth, I was now the one holding the strings to his entire empire. And in less than 2 days, those strings would begin to tighten. The 72 hours passed slowly, every tick of the clock like a drumbeat that only I could hear. On the surface, my life looked unchanged. I went grocery shopping. I cleaned my apartment. I even sat in a cafe reading a novel. But under that calm surface, a storm was building. The exact second the clause activated, my scheduled email released itself into the inboxes of Armitage Global's legal department. The moment the message left my server, I leaned back in my chair and whispered to myself, "It has begun." It did not take long. The first call came less than 3 hours later. An unfamiliar number lit up my phone, international code flashing across the screen. When I answered, a crisp British voice introduced herself as Clara Voss, head of legal for Armitage Global. She wasted no time with pleasantries. "Ms. Carter, we have received your correspondence. Are you confirming that ownership of the Helios encryption system now rests with you personally?" I kept my voice steady, polite, factual. "Yes, ma'am. The transfer is documented and legally binding. Any use of the system must go through Carter Innovations, LLC." There was silence, then the quiet scratching of a pen. She thanked me and hung up. No outrage, no disbelief, just professional recognition. That silence was more powerful than any words. The second call came an hour later, this time from Helios's chief financial officer, David O'Connell, a man in his 50s who had always treated me like a background fixture. His voice was tight, almost panicked. "Elena, what is this email Armitage just forwarded us? Some kind of mistake? Please tell me you didn't actually—" I interrupted him before he could finish. "David, the contract is clear. Brandon fired me within 90 days of completion. Ownership shifted. It's not a mistake," he sputtered, his composure unraveling. "Do you understand what you've done? This acquisition is critical. Billions in valuation are on the line." I almost laughed at the sudden shift. 12 years they ignored me, and now my name was on every phone in their office. The third call rattled me more than the first two. It was the director of mergers from Armitage Global himself, a man named Julian Becker, heavy-voiced, German accent, not someone who enjoyed surprises. "Ms. Carter, our understanding was that Helios owned this technology. You are telling me otherwise. If this is true, our entire acquisition must be reevaluated." His tone was sharp, but beneath it I detected something else, respect. He was not dismissing me. He was recalculating. I assured him calmly that the rights now belonged to me, and I offered to provide notarized documents to confirm. He agreed, thanked me, and ended the call abruptly. I sat in silence afterward, heart pounding, realizing the full scale of what had just happened. I was no longer the hidden architect behind the curtain. I was the deal itself. Then came the fourth call, the one I had both dreaded and longed for. "Brandon Hale." His voice was louder than it needed to be, anger spilling through the speaker as if volume could erase reality. "Elena, what the hell are you playing at? This nonsense you sent Armitage? It's sabotage. You will ruin everything." I let him rant for a full minute, his words stumbling over themselves, before I spoke. "Brandon, you fired me. And in doing so, you triggered a clause you never bothered to read. This isn't sabotage. This is law." There was a pause, the kind where you can almost hear the blood draining from someone's face. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost unsteady. You "You cannot do this." My reply was steady, almost gentle. "I already have." Then I ended the call. I set my phone down and stared at the city skyline outside my window. The lights of Chicago glimmered back at me like 1,000 tiny witnesses. In less than half a day, 4 calls had confirmed what I already knew. Helios was unraveling. Armitage no longer trusted them. And Brandon, the man who had once told me I would not be part of the new era, had just discovered that the new era would belong to me. By the next morning, the quiet phone calls had turned into a storm. Emails were flying, lawyers were scrambling, and Helios Data Corps was bleeding from wounds Brandon never even saw coming. What had begun as whispers between executives overnight became headlines by noon. The merger that was supposed to elevate Helios into the global spotlight was suddenly teetering on the edge of collapse, and the world was watching. The first blow came from Armitage Global itself. They issued a formal statement announcing a pause in negotiations pending ownership clarification of key intellectual property. I read those words 3 times, each syllable striking like a bell toll. Brandon had told me I would not be part of the new era, and now his new era was being dismantled sentence by sentence in public. The market reacted instantly. Helios stock plummeted 22% in a single trading session. Investors panicked, employees whispered, and the boardroom turned into a battlefield. I was not in that room, but I did not need to be. I could imagine every second of it. Brandon pacing, his uncle shouting, lawyers fumbling with papers that could not undo what had already been written. By midday, the press had begun to smell blood. Reporters reached out to me, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, all asking the same question. Was it true? Had I really taken control of the encryption system? I ignored them. Silence is sometimes louder than words, and my silence only deepened the panic inside Helios. Every unanswered question was another spark to the fire. Every moment without denial was confirmation in itself. That evening, a former colleague texted me quietly, "Brandon is losing it. He thought the hard drive you left on your desk had the files. He tried to parade it in front of the board, but it is empty. He is humiliated." I stared at that message, and for the first time since all of this began, I let myself laugh. Not out of cruelty, but out of vindication. He had taken the bait exactly as I planned. In trying to prove he had bested me, he had revealed his own incompetence to the very people whose approval he craved. But humiliation alone was not enough to stop the bleeding. By the second day, Helios stock had fallen another 16%. Analysts on television began calling the merger doomed, questioning how a company could fumble ownership of the very asset they were trying to sell. Brandon's name appeared in every headline, not as the heir to a legacy, but as the reckless nephew who had destroyed it. I watched the broadcasts from my living room, the glow of the screen painting the walls, and felt a strange calm settle over me. This was not vengeance delivered by my hand alone. This was arrogance collapsing under its own weight. Inside me, though, there was no triumphal cheer. There was only a steady, measured satisfaction. 12 years of loyalty had been dismissed with a smirk and a signature, and now 12 years of my work was reclaiming its rightful place. What Brandon saw as sabotage was nothing more than consequence. He had struck blindly, and the blow had landed squarely on himself. By the end of that week, rumors leaked that the board had convened an emergency meeting to discuss Brandon's leadership. Words like gross negligence and fiduciary risk floated through the air. Those words do not disappear easily once spoken. They stain reputations like ink. Brandon's smirk, his polished arrogance, his empty words about a new era. All of it was dissolving under the weight of reality. And as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee while headlines scrolled across my screen, one thought lingered in my mind, steady and undeniable. He told me I would not be part of the new era. And now, the new era would arrive without him. When a storm destroys a house, the rubble left behind tells you who built it strong and who built it on sand. By the end of that disastrous week, Helios Data Core was standing in rubble, and Armitage Global was already searching for stronger ground. I did not expect what came next, but I cannot say I was surprised either. The same way arrogance blinds, desperation clears the eyes. And Armitage Global, for all their corporate polish, knew how to recognize the real source of power when they saw it. It began with a simple email, marked confidential, sent directly to me. The subject line read, Proposal for Carter Innovations, LLC. I opened it cautiously, my heart pounding even though my face stayed calm. Inside was an invitation to meet with Armitage's executive team. Not in Helios's boardroom, not under Brandon Hale's watchful eye, but at a neutral site in New York City. The words were clear, professional, and direct. They wanted to discuss a partnership with me personally. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to believe it was a trick, some desperate move by Helios to lure me into compromise. But the sender's name was unmistakable. Julian Becker, Director of Mergers, the same man who had called me days earlier with suspicion in his voice. Now the suspicion was gone. In its place was respect. 2 days later, I sat in a glass tower overlooking Manhattan, the city stretching out like an endless promise. Across the polished table sat Julian, Clara Voss, and 2 other Armitage executives whose eyes never left mine. There were no theatrics, no small talk. Julian leaned forward, his German accent steady, his words precise. Ms. Carter, we have reviewed the contracts. Ownership is yours, undisputed. We are prepared to offer Carter Innovations a direct licensing agreement, a multi-year deal, $35 million upfront, with royalties attached. I did not let my jaw drop, though inside me every nerve screamed at the number. $35 million. More than I had ever imagined for myself, more than Helios had ever paid me in all my years combined. For a second, I thought of Brandon, of his smirk, of his declaration that I would not be part of the new era. And here I was, at the new table, while his had already collapsed. I asked questions. I kept my voice steady. I reviewed their terms line by line. But inside, I knew this was more than a contract. This was vindication. This was proof that I had never been the expendable cog they thought I was. I had been the engine all along. And now, the world was finally treating me as such. After the meeting, Julian extended his hand and looked me directly in the eye. You are not the type of person people should underestimate, he said. I shook his hand firmly and replied, They already did. For the first time in years, I felt something rise in me that had been buried beneath resentment and humiliation. Pride. Not the fragile pride of titles or bonuses, but the unshakable pride of ownership, of knowing that what I built was mine, and no one could strip it away again. When I returned home to Chicago, I found messages waiting for me. Former colleagues had heard whispers. Some congratulated me quietly. Some asked if I had positions open. Even my attorney Marcus left me a voicemail, his voice laced with satisfaction. You did it, Elena. You turned their arrogance into your empire. I poured myself a glass of wine that evening and sat by the window, the city lights glowing below me. Helios was still unraveling, Brandon still scrambling, the board still tearing itself apart. But none of that mattered now. My path was no longer tied to theirs. I had been invited to a new table, one built not on nepotism, not on arrogance, but on respect. And this time, I was not just a guest. I was the one bringing the crown jewel. There is a moment in every battle where you realize the war has already been decided, not by who shouted the loudest, but by who played the longest game. For Helios Data Core, that moment came when Armitage Global publicly announced the termination of their acquisition. The statement was simple, almost cold, but its effect was devastating. Due to failure to secure intellectual property rights, Armitage Global Networks has elected not to proceed with the Helios Data Core acquisition. Just like that, the $240 million dream evaporated into smoke. I read the article twice, sipping my coffee, my pulse steady. On the same page was a second headline: Helios Stock Craters, Leadership Under Fire. Brandon's name was plastered across the piece, no longer as the heir apparent, but as the reckless executive who had destroyed the future of the company. Shareholders were furious, employees were fleeing, and the board had reportedly stripped him of all decision-making authority. It was the kind of downfall that unfolds not in silence, but in the full glare of the public eye. And all of it had been set in motion the moment he looked me in the eye and said, "You will not be part of the new era." But the story did not end with his humiliation. For me, it was just the beginning. Carter Innovations, LLC, was no longer a name on paper. It was real. It was alive. With Armitage Global's licensing agreement signed and sealed, I became the sole owner of the encryption engine that had once been Helios's crown jewel. I hired a small team of my own, not flashy, just brilliant people who believed in the work. For the first time, I was not building under someone else's shadow. I was building for myself. Every morning when I walked into my new office, a modest space in downtown Chicago with sunlight pouring through tall windows, I felt a surge of pride I had never known at Helios. There were no smirks waiting for me, no careless words dismissing my worth. There was only the quiet hum of servers, the chatter of a team that respected me, and the knowledge that I had turned betrayal into foundation. My foundation. Still, sometimes at night, I thought about Brandon. I wondered what it felt like when the truth finally sank in, when he realized the empire he had tried to build on arrogance and nepotism had collapsed under his own ignorance. I did not imagine him with anger anymore. No, what I felt was something quieter, sharper. Pity, perhaps, mixed with a strange satisfaction. He had believed that leadership was about power handed down by family ties. I had proven that real power comes from creation, from persistence, from being underestimated until the moment you cannot be ignored. The lesson, I realized, was not just about revenge, though revenge had certainly been part of it. The deeper truth was about ownership. For years, I had given Helios everything, believing loyalty would be enough. But loyalty means nothing to those who measure value only in profits and appearances. What matters is claiming what you build, protecting it, and never letting anyone strip it away. In the end, Brandon tried to erase me, and instead, I erased his future. Now, when people ask about my story, I tell them this: never underestimate the power of the fine print. Never underestimate the strength of patience. And never underestimate a woman who has been told she does not belong. Because sometimes, the quietest voice carries the sharpest blade. As I close my laptop each night and glance at the skyline glowing outside my window, I carry no bitterness anymore. Just pride. I survived the strike meant to cut me down, and I turned it into the victory of my life. And though Brandon Hale once told me I would not be part of the new era, the truth is undeniable. The new era is mine.